Good evening and welcome to another edition of Historical Sketches. When events do not make sense or are such as a sense cannot untie, an option is to forget all about them. We can call that the head in the sand solution. Another option is to remember that man is but a quintessence of dust, and often, therefore, not even worth the dust that the rude wind blows in his face. Yet another option is an attempt at interpretation, with emphasis, I say, on attempt and limits on interpretation. In this instance, the events in question are 1. The claim by Western signatories of the so-called Minsk Agreement on Ukraine in 2014 that they did not intend to respect them, and 2. That the commitment by the USA to Gorbachev in 1989 not to expand NATO eastward was invalid for not having been set down in writing. But how can we interpret shamelessness? For to define through shamelessness, what is it but to be nothing else but shameless, at least Shakespeareanly speaking. In past historical occasions, perjurers usually found some fancy or preposterous reason to justify their behavior. Often, those affected by the perjury sought redress through vengeance, leading to bitter wars and to the execution of the perjurers. For example, during the 100-Year War, from 1337 to 1453, King Henry V uncovered and executed 3 English traitors, the Earl of Cambridge, Lord Scrope, and Sir Thomas Grey, who were working for the French king. Given this and other precedents, the current belligerent stance of US and NATO versus Russia, or against Russia, is really astonishing, for the Western juntas and their puppets find no shame in hiding their bad faith. And yet, an avowed impostor usually still triggers more dislike than admiration, for the difference between an impostor and a traitor is one of degree, I would say not of substance. And breach of trust, at least at large, is still rated more negatively than positively. For example, it is not something that a job applicant, at least as yet, would claim in his resume as a strength. For example, I am particularly skilled at breaching the trust placed on me by whomsoever. But the American and Western European actors involved in the current breaches of trust do not seemingly care. Therefore, the tragic, absurd, and Orwellian posture of political and Zionist America, with Europe in tow, towards the Ukrainian business and war, should give us pause, considering that history is concerned with the relation between the unique and the general, and the historian can no more separate them, meaning the unique and the general, or give precedence to one over the other, that he can separate fact from interpretation. Further, considering that there are as many interpretations as there are tongues, are hands, are accidents, as Shakespeare would say. In this writing, I will deal separately with the 2 main parties involved, Russia and the USA, for let me say, puppets nominally rule the European Union, and their media, I would say, is historically irrelevant. One socio-political interpretation may be perhaps found well over 20 years ago. That is, a related, let's say, pattern-setting event can be traced back to the Clinton-Lewinsky business. When the President of the United States had the gall to tell the nation in prime time that I did not have sex with that woman, notwithstanding ample legal and irrefutable evidence. that the president of the exceptional nation would allow himself to be entrapped into an obvious, decidedly bawdy situation, let's put it that way, while simultaneously showing himself as the lyingest knave in Christendom, should at least have raised some doubts about his qualification for the position. But it did not, and at the time, various qualified voices expressed concern about the implication of the resolution to keep him in power, for when a preposterous lie to the public and Parliament by the highest representative of the state is essentially endorsed by allowing the perjurer, for he was under oath, for allowing the perjurer to remain in office, a pattern in precedence is established for others to follow suit in times to come. One obvious, recent, and worthy fellow and follower is Joseph Biden, along with his remarkable family, and we can see clearly an evolution. For what with Clinton was a matter of lying to save his bottom, let's put it this way, with Biden lying seems actually a matter of pride, as when he said with a straight face that 18 FBI agents had verified that Hunter Biden's laptop is Russian disinformation. Yet, already with the Lewinsky business, the list of patent, unrestrained, and preposterous lies by subsequent U.S. State Department administrations make a long list, beginning with Yugoslavia, followed by the very murky 9/11 affair, Saddam's weapons of mass destruction, Gaddafi breach of human rights, Assad chemical poisons in Syria, bringing democracy to Afghanistan, to Georgia, Ukraine, and the Middle East, as well as the Middle Eastern terrorist groups that are enemy one day and freedom fighters the next, financed and supplied in either case by the exceptional nation. Donald Rumsfeld, departed and not really missed Secretary of Defense, said it best: we create our own reality. And in the circumstances, it is already extraordinary that seemingly a majority of the American people have not followed suit. Otherwise, most of us would be forced to walk around town with a loaded AK-47, and each state would be transformed into a myriad of mini Ukraines at war with each other. Another yarn to unravel, or issue to interpret, if we like, in the limited confines of an essay, of a presentation, is the political ideological relationship between the US and the Russian Federation. As far as the US, my perception, for what is worth, derived from a possibly unwarranted extrapolation of impressions gained over the years by observing behavior, reaction, and points of view among people whom I either know personally at work, or have known, or socially, or whose manners and expressions I had occasion to follow on various media channels. To begin with, and however obvious, it is unfair and useless to tag or label the action of one or more U.S. government's politicians, questionable bigwigs, or equally questionable oligarchs as representing the Americans. Further considering that, historically and commercially, the evil and turbid sell more than the good and the limpid, and since to things of sale a seller's praise belongs, the relentless media-driven emphasis on prurient narratives of evil ends up popularizing it. Considering that notoriety contains in itself an undeclared or hidden element or quasi-praise, praise not for the evil act, but for the profit produced by the sale of evil. Therefore, in the end, the evil, the turbid, and the prurient join together to maximize the return. A proposition beautifully condensed in the expression, anything for a buck. I will not pursue further this line other than with a few remarks on what I think remains of the collective American psyche until, if the trend continues, it will be overrun by the New World Order, transgenderism, fluid sexuality, male maternity, wokeism, cancel culture, transgenderism, and various other Gomorrish items of insanity, leading finally to the satanic substitution or replacement of the Western European population or population of that extraction as promoted by various notorious and vocal so-called intellectuals. At the root of the historical American psyche, it could be said that there are two prevailing worldviews, quite different from each other, and yet both deriving from events associated with the birth of the nation and the so-called conquest of the American West. According to one view, man has to do with the practical, the risky, the impending, and the inevitable. He must assert himself whatever the circumstances and the consequences. He is the macho man, the winner who takes all. Whereas culture is essentially a feminine thing, as women are exempted from the masculine duties and have time to spare. A man, or a nation for that matter, who presents a posture of respect, regard, conformity to good form, aperture to disinterested friendship, interest, maybe with a view to learn the good points of the other, this person is essentially weak. This version of the American man may admire, for example, Lincoln for having crushed the South, but especially for having succeeded in ignoring the statutes of the Confederation, which included the option for the single states to leave the Union. And perhaps, above all, for having been so smart as to sell the idea that the war was declared to free the slaves rather than to passively ignore the covenant of the Union. Can one be smarter than that? A more modern version of the macho man is captured or described by the famous sentence, "Speak softly but carry a big stick," a philosophy applicable to reluctant regimes, especially in South and Central America. The assumption being that genuine kindness is a sign of weakness, and he who wastes his time in culture, let's put it this way, is equally weak and unsuited to lead armies into battle or economists into plunder. Of course, I am broadly simplifying and generalizing, but I have personally watched one such man and his entourage drive to the ground a successful and innovative Fortune 500 corporation, which eventually was sold to the proverbial highest bidder, but I also know of other cases. These traits describe in their entirety what I call the Class A Americans, A for arrogant and for simplification. They are not the majority by any means, and yet, by default, by design, or through the inscrutable paths of fate, they end up projecting abroad the cartoon image of the typical American. Security is a nominal, illogical reason why this class imposes criminal measures on behalf of the rest of the nation, claiming to act for the nation's interest, unable or unwilling to realize that the most tragic form of loss isn't the loss of security, rather the loss of the capacity to imagine that things could be different. But counteracting the macho view, there is luckily the great majority of the other Americans who are helpful, independent, practical, kind, considerate, genuinely interested in others, generous and helpful to their neighbors as a matter of course. These traits were equally necessary and indispensable during the so-called conquest of the West, and they equally and globally describe the Class H American. I call it H for humanity. In an extremely simplified and maybe questionable view, but I think it goes beyond the mere generalization captured by the sentence, there are good and bad people everywhere or similar. In fact, I do not think it is far-fetched to detect in the proliferation and almost exaltation of transgenderism, fluid sexuality, etc., a kind of psychological reaction to the cult of the macho man of the American sort. Moving now to Russia, the prevailing and official US macho man attitude is reflected and enhanced by the current posture of the US administration in the Ukrainian business. I will attempt, however cursorily, to observe Russia's current posture on Ukraine and on the world at large in the context of Russian history and of the present historical moment. Some may recall proverbial statements by notable personalities about the mystery and the difficulty of understanding Russia, and notorious is Churchill's saying about Russia being a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. Actually, in the past, even notable Russians were not so shy about the issue, admitting not to understand their own nation. So much so that Dostoevsky, in his Diary of a Writer, pokes fun at this doubting class of Russians. In days gone by, he says, the words "I understand nothing" meant merely ignorance on the part of him who uttered them. Yet at the present they bring great honor. One has only to declare with an open air and snobbishly, "I do not understand religion, I understand nothing in Russia, I understand nothing in art," and at once he is lifted to lofty heights. And this is all the more advantageous if one, in fact, understands nothing. However, this simplified device proves nothing, etc., etc. It is possible to follow some of the speculations that may explain the effect of such national self-questioning. Of course, in this field no theory is complete, but any is better than none. Russian culture is the tale of three cities: Kiev, Moscow, and St. Petersburg. Kiev was founded around the 8th century, Moscow in the 12th, and St. Petersburg at the beginning of the 18th century. For traditional chroniclers and historians, Kiev has remained the mother of Russian cities, and memories of its accomplishments gave to the Orthodox Eastern Russians an enduring sense of unity, especially in the midst of the religious turmoil, when the confrontation between Poland's Catholicism and Ukraine's Orthodox Christianity led eventually to the Treaty of Pereyaslav in 1654 and the formal annexation of Ukraine to Russia, thanks to which the Cossack ruler Bohdan Khmelnytsky, who was confronting the attacks and belligerence of Poland-Lithuania at the time, sought to join Russia and pledge the allegiance of Ukraine to the Tsar. According to one school of thought, the year 1252 marks the beginning of the historical cultural split between Russia and the rest of Europe, when Alexander Nevsky, a most beloved protagonist in the history of Russia, struck an agreement with Khan Bayi of the Mongol Golden Horde, whereby Nevsky could reign as a sovereign of Kiev and of Russia. This was a situation quite different from that in the West, where Western kings or emperors needed the benediction of the Pope and of the Church to be able to reign, or if not, suffer excommunication. And this on the ground that the Pope was the Prime Minister of God, and God, via the Pope, conferred on the kings the authority to rule, to reign. One historical famous consequence of this arrangement took place when the German Henry IV was Emperor of the Western Roman Empire, and Gregory VII was the Pope. Henry nominated as Bishop of Milan a prelate not approved by the Pope, but upon Gregory VII excommunicated the Emperor, and the Emperor excommunicated the Pope. In that instance with Henry IV in 1077, Henry had to yield and do penance by waiting in the winter snow for 3 days and nights outside the castle of the Countess Matilde of Canossa, who was heir to a feudal domain that comprised most of northern Italy and a good part of central Italy. He had to wait outside until being received and eventually pardoned by the Pope. The feud became symbolic of what is called the fight for the investitures, meaning the fight for who really called the shots, so to speak, when electing high-rank church officials, who was the ruler, the Pope or the Emperor. None of this occurred in Russia. Nevsky, with much questionable simplification, if we wish, not having to fight in the east, was able to pursue a nation-consolidating policy on the Western Front. He fought victorious and legendary battles against the German and the Swedish invaders, and he served as Prince of Novgorod, Grand Prince of Kiev, and Grand Prince of Vladimir during some of the most difficult times of the history of Kievan Rus. The difference with the West is that there were bitter and sometimes deadly religious disputes inside the Orthodox Church and various factions, but they did not affect, on the whole, they did not affect the integrity of the state. All the while, Russia could pursue her eastern expansion, mostly with agreements and treaties with various eastern potentates. It may be instructive to compare significant historical events during the same time frame in Eastern and Western Europe and their respective impact. Nevsky agreement with the Mongols took place in 1252, 2 years after the death in the West of Emperor Frederick II of Swabia, Holy Roman Emperor, who had a German father, a Norman mother, and a Sicilian upbringing. The goal of Frederick II was to restore the glories of Charlemagne and Charlemagne's original Western Roman Empire, established in 800 AD and later plagued by internal dispute and splits and wars. Frederick II did not seem interested in Northern and Eastern Europe. He did not succeed in revitalizing the Western Roman Empire, whereas Nevsky succeeded in building the base of the Russian state and eventually the Russian Empire. To the success of one and the failure of the other, historians have attributed the beginning of the difference between the developments of Russia and of the rest of Europe, as well as the notably different and respective, as it is called, Weltanschauung, view of the world. Pope Gregory IX supported or encouraged the effort at destroying the Orthodox Church, which culminated in a famous battle between the Western Coalition, which at the time included the Poles, the Danes, the Swedes, Baltic elements, and German forces, which was a kind of NATO of the time, against Alexander Nevsky, whose army comprised the Mongol archers on horse. He won the Battle of Papus on the frozen lake by that name in 1242, which is now the border between Estonia and Russia. And in that battle, the Mongols, allied with Nevsky, forced the antagonist cavalry to retreat on the part of the lake where the ice was thinner, and this ice broke under the weight of the heavy medieval armory of the enemy. There was a schism in the Russian Orthodox Church about 150 years after the Catholic-Protestant Western Schism, triggered, as we know, by Luther in 1517. But the outward cause of the Russian dispute had to do with issues that, I assume, even to a Western mind of the time, may have appeared somewhat odd, such, for example, as the advocates of unison versus harmony in singing, the use of 2 fingers instead of 3 fingers in making the sign of the cross, and similar other issues. Whereas the Western schism had to do with the sought-for independence by Luther and the Protestants from Catholic Rome. According to many, the most emblematic character in the clash between Eastern and Western culture was Peter the Great, which lived from 1572 to 1625 or 1725, as described by an eminent Russian historian. His Russian traits were simplicity, coarseness, dislike of ceremony, dislike of conventions and etiquette, a curious sort of democracy, a love of truth and equity, a love of Russia, and at the same time the elemental nature of a wild beast was awake in him. And there were traits in Peter the Great that may be compared with the Bolsheviks, perhaps, and some historians have even defined Peter the Great as the first Bolshevik. In the wake of Peter the Great's era, both French Enlightenment and German Romanticism were imported into Russia. And emblematic of this influence that French philosophers had on Russian culture was the era of the so-called reforming despots, in turn exemplified by Empress Catherine the Great and her correspondence with the French Voltaire. In the wake of these new links and connections, a wave of admiration for France and French culture spread across the Russian nobility and intellectuals at large. It became fashionable to speak French alongside Russian at home and on social occasion, and it is a curiosity reflected in a number of Russian classic novels. By the way, this is one more point that throws into ridicule the current subservience of the French government to the dictates of the European Union and the US. Anyway, following or out of the wave of thought inspired by Peter's reforms and the strong connection with the European Illuminist thinking, came that stream of Russian literature that has ennobled mankind in a unique and inimitable way, and that has enabled Russia, even allowing for the intervening distortions, the folly and the absurdity of Bolshevism. It has remained and still remains so far a bastion of resistance against the plague of cancel culture, wokeism, and such other issues. In fact, in my view, even in Gorbachev, whose life I have described in a previous video of the series, it is possible to find the traits of 2 of Dostoevsky brothers Karamazov, the adventurous Dmitri, reflected in Gorbachev's daring, let's call it daring opening towards the West, and the sincere and spiritual Alexei, that can be reflected in Gorbachev's belief that his Western counterparts spoke and acted in good faith. Finally, the considerations I made are certainly not sufficient for drawing a comparison between 2 states, 2 people, 2 histories, and 2 cultures. In partial excuse, I can only repeat what Dr. Johnson said of dictionaries: no dictionary is perfect, but any is better than none. Thank you for watching, and as usual, may all the number of the stars give light to your fair way. Good night.